Wood joinery lasts longer than any screws or nails can ever last. That's why we're going to be building an all wood gate using 1-minute dovetail tenons using these jigs. We're going to be using a router and these two jigs. Let me show you how. First, let me show you the small sample. So this is essentially what we're doing right here. We're going to be cutting a dovetail into a 2x4 and also cutting the mortise into this 2x4. So this is clearly a 2x6. This is a 2x4, but this kind of shows that you can choose any size stock material, even 2x6s, or if you were crazy enough to orient them like this, you could make a tenon that reaches all the way down here. I think this guy reaches a total of about 7.5 inches or so. But first, let me show you the small sample. So this is a 2x4, and that's the dovetail that we're going to be cutting out of the 2x4. So you can see that the dovetail actually doesn't reach all the way to the bottom, and that's so that you still have some meat down here in the mortise, so it doesn't just sever all the fibers. So here is that mortise. So I've cut various mortises in here. You can see this one's a little bit larger. This is the one for our 2x4. That piece slides right in. And it's nice and flush with the top. Maybe a little bit of sanding, perhaps some planing, and good to go. Now, it's not only good for 2x4s, you could also use it for 2x6s. This one's a little bit tighter. And then this one is to show the max length that you could do for these size tenons. So you can see this is roughly 7.5 inches or so, and you can even mortise it in line like this. So I'm going to go ahead and put that piece right in there. And this was all made using these two jigs. So here's the first piece that we're going to be working on. So it's held at a funny angle like this because I like to get this end grain right here about as vertical as possible, so that when I put my jig on there and my router, I'm actually routing as vertical as possible. If I set this horizontally like this, you can see that it's kind of a weird situation to be routing in this plane. So this is about as good as we can get. This piece is roughly 5 feet long, so I have this weird contraption called a Moxon vise. I have some of these because I do dovetail joinery, so this is easy for me to set up. If you don't have this, you can use a number of clamps and kind of affix it to whatever surface that you need to be able to get this end grain as vertical as possible. Or rather, as horizontal as possible. The piece needs to be about as vertical as possible. Anyway, enough of that. So this is the jig that we're going to be using. So this is the tenon jig for the 2x dovetail set. Okay, and this one comes with this attachment as well as another one. So you'll see here that there's various numbers. It starts at 2 all the way to 8. That's roughly the size of tenon that you're going to get. Anyway, I believe that when we're using this for 2x4s, we're going to set it at number 3. Now this index piece has 2 orientations. You can see that these squares either line up with the face or there's an offset. That offset is so that you can get in between these numbers. So if, let's say you want to do 2.5, you set it at 3 with the index with the offset down, and now you're routing at 2.5. So it depends on the size of material that you're using, but I believe that for this 2x4 we're actually going to set it at number 3 with no offset. So just straight up number 3. Let's see if that works. Okay. So like I said, we're going to set it at that number 3, like this, with no offset, so meaning that the squares are flush with the bottom of that index. Okay, like that, number 3. We're going to turn it around, and what I'm looking for is, so you can see these pieces right here kind of guide the 2x4 into the middle of it. So you really want this piece right here kind of down the center of your 2x4, which that index on the back helps you do. But what you're really looking for is that there's some support down here. If I make this piece any longer, this part of the jig down here is just going to flex, meaning that the router is not going to stay flush. So the whole point of this exterior surface is to be able to keep your router about as flush and straight as possible as you do the entire surface. So right here. So this is perfect. I'm going to go ahead and drill a couple pilot holes and put in 2 screws. There. So it doesn't need to be super tight. You don't need to set your clutch to drill or 15 or anything like that. Just light enough or tight enough so that the jig doesn't really move. So those 2 screws are good enough for this situation right now. Okay, so now I'm ready to get my router. Start on this side, go all the way like this. And usually when I get to this point, I take it back out, I turn it off, take it back out, and come in from the other side. Okay, I prefer coming this way because the router spins in this direction, so it doesn't blow out very much on this side. This is the side that you have to be careful with. What I end up doing is I kind of take off the outer layer, and then as I take off more and more material, I caress the actual part of the jig and actually take off that final cut. Now remember guys, this is plastic. That bearing can be spinning at roughly 20,000 RPM. It can get really hot, so it can melt the jig. So what I end up doing is I kind of go in between this channel with that router bit and the bearing, take off as much wood as I can, kind of freehand, and then hug the jig and make my final cut. And that's going to give me my final clean surface. So this is the router that I'm using. This is a Skill 10 amp router. Nothing really fancy about it. You set the speed on it over here. I set it to roughly 5. Here's where the magic is. This is a 1 1/8 of an inch dovetail router bit. And the weird situation about this is that I got to get this 3/4 inch outer diameter bearing on there, but because the way that the router bit is, I have to put collars at the bottom and at the top so that I can actually use that bearing right there. Otherwise, if I only put a collar at the top, this bearing tends to slide down and then just kind of flop around, and it's not really effective. Anyway, the other thing that you'll notice is that I have this really wide base plate. You could absolutely use the base plate that the router comes with, but I like this one because it gives me a little bit more stability. And this is nothing more than just a piece of plexiglass that I drilled a hole into the middle and then drilled the holes for where those screws go into to hold it down to the base. Okay. Now, when I set this onto the jig, I have to make sure that the cutting edge, the very top cutting edge over here, is flush with the bottom of the jig, right? That way I'm getting the full depth of the router bit. Otherwise, if I don't do that, the pieces are probably not going to fit together. Okay, and once I set it, and I don't move it ever again. And I make all my cuts, and then I can move it if I want to. But once you set the router bit depth, don't move it. So as you can see here, this guy blew out right here. I'm not really concerned about this because this is a gate that's going to be outside. If I'm really concerned about it, I can always fill it in with some putty or glue this down and then reroute it, cut it out. But I'm just going to take it off, put it away. I'm not really concerned about it. Okay, so now just take off the jig. And you may have noticed that in the middle of routing, that index piece on the back fell off, and it really didn't affect anything of our routing because it really doesn't really need to be there after you've affixed the jig on there. So if you want, you can take it off prematurely or just let it fall down or just keep it on there. It's not a big deal. There's enough clearance on there that the router bit's not going to cut into it. Okay, so there's 2 things that we need to do to this right now. One is we need to remove this extra piece of material down here, and 2 is we need to shave just a hair off of this end grain over here. And the reason is that this tenon is going to be the exact same size and shape as the mortise, and that's not good because that means that the tenon is going to bottom out on the back face of the mortise, meaning that it's going to bind and it's going to crack the mortise when we get in there. So we got to shave just a little bit off of there. So first I like to use a saw on the cross cut and just cut this. And if it doesn't come out perfect, that's okay. You can always use a chisel and clean it back up. But now we're going to go ahead and trim just a little bit off that face. I like to use an electric planer, and I usually go from this direction downward because I don't care if I have blowout down here. What I care about is too much blowout on the top. So I actually, in some cases, I do half and half. It really just depends on how you feel. This situation's a little bit awkward, so I'm just going to try to go from the top down in one pass. No, that's enough to prevent any binding when we put this tenon into the jig. Sorry, into the mortise. Okay, so now we're ready to do the other part. The second half of this, just make sure that you have the same orientation. It'd be really crummy for you to do one tenon and then flip the piece and then have the tenon be on the opposite side. So make sure that the orientation is the same on both sides of the piece that you're cutting to. And there it is. Got a little bit of tear out on the bottom, but that's not really a big deal because still the cheeks are really what's going to be doing the work. And plus the base of the actual tenon is still intact. So this guy's done. On to 2 more of these and then the mortises. Okay, so after you recovered from cutting all these tenons and getting all the sawdust off of you, then it's time to make some more sawdust and cut the mortises into these pieces. So these 2x4s are going to be vertical and they're going to have 3 mortises cut into them, one here, one in the middle, and one at the other end. So I like to leave roughly 4 inches of relish over here. That's to prevent any sort of damage. So once this tenon comes into this mortise, I don't really want this piece of wood to kind of flop on me, which is why you can't put the mortise all the way at the end. So 4 inches is plenty generous for that piece of wood to stay intact and for you to not have any issues. So we're done with these pieces, so we'll put them away. And now we're going to use the mortising jig. So it says mortise jig up here, 2x dovetail router jig. Okay, and the same way has these numbers on the back and an index piece that has the same configuration as the one for the tenon jig. So there's an offset piece and then there's a flush setting. So we're going to use the number 3 and flush with the number 3. And here's the cool thing, is that all you have to do is strike that line where you want the mortise, and then there's a center line marking at the very bottom. You just line that up with the line, screw this into place, and that's your jig. That's where you're going to route. Okay. So I'm going to drill 2 pilot holes. Now we're ready to route. Now I'm going to be routing it with the same router bit, and I haven't changed the setting or the depth on this bit at all, so that's absolutely critical for when you do this mortise. Okay, so take it straight from the tenon and do this one. If you do the mortise first, that's fine. Just set, they have the same configuration, right? So if you set the depth on this one instead, make sure that you save that same configuration and then use your cut the tenon using that same depth. Okay. You may also notice that I have a big window here for me to be able to see. If I use it on the other side, I can't really see, so I like to have this large spot over here so I can see what's going on. And I'm going to try to stay away from that jig as much as possible, at least to begin with. So I think using this jig is much simpler than using the tenon jig because you don't actually have to center it onto the 2x4 or the end grain or do any sort of trimming. This one, you literally just put the jig down to the configuration that you need and route that section out. Obviously, once again, it's plastic. Don't ride the actual jig until you're ready for that final cut. So what I like to do is keep the bearing on the inside, make sort of half moon passes. It is going to be a little bit tricky because that big dovetail bit has to take off a lot of material at a time. So go slowly. You might see a little bit of smoke, especially with Douglas fir. It's going to happen, right? But rest assured that I've cut plenty of dovetails, at least with this jig, and haven't had any issues, okay? So once you're ready for that final pass, then you can ride the jig on one clean pass and get that mortise nice and fresh looking. and that's it. And then the only thing that I like to do is clean up these fuzzies sometimes. So I'll take a box cutter blade. That's one completed mortise, and you still have plenty of material here and here for this 2x4 to be completely intact. Alright, now to the last part, which is assembly. So I'm going to do a small amount of dry fitting, make sure that they go in kind of smoothly, and then take them apart, glue them, and let it sit. There it is. There's the gate frame. So now this piece is going to have two diagonals, one going this way and one going in that direction, and that will hopefully be enough to keep this gate from sagging and moving too much. And there you have it, folks. A sturdy, no-nail gate that's going to last, made with these jigs.